Aha! This is Laborz, and it is so nice to have you here. These are the paints you need. First, I grab the airbrush and cover all the skin parts with Deathworld Forest. On the ID card, Juggernaut has a very dark red suit, so a green foundation of the skin would create some nice complementary contrast with the red. The green is quite desaturated, which works great for an undead skin tone, but purples and browns could be used here as well. I'm not worrying too much about overspraying. I just want to cover the skin while having some gradient that I create by having less layers on the shadowy areas. Once I'm done with that, then comes the red parts. To create the dark red color, we need to use less volume for our highlights. You can't really reach an opacity with the airbrush like with a brush, but that's not a problem, since now we can create these very dark red shadow tones. However, I would build up the opacity over the highlight areas, but on the extreme shadows I just like to add so many layers that the paint will diffuse the satin finish of my primer. I try not to overspray the green parts, and on the hands and torso it's quite easy to do that, but I don't want to spray over the holes of the helmet covering the eyes and mouth. We will use a brush in a later step, so that's perfectly fine if you miss those areas for now. Clean your airbrush because we are not going to need it for a while. Paint the eyes and teeth with ice yellow. Load your brush up to the brim with paint and shape the tip on your knuckle to make it pointy like Granny's nipples. Always going from the sides once you have a pointed tip, and make sure that you are using base layer consistency. Now for one of the eyes I'm going to go in from the front so that the camera sees what I'm doing, but do not do that. Always go in from the sides, okay? Or I will slap on your tiny hand. After that we paint the teeth, which is quite easy because they are very big, and leave some tiny black line between each tooth to make them more defined. He got too big for tooth, so make sure you cover other teeth next to those because he's going to look like a rabbit if you do. Let's cover the skin with a mix of brown rose and Deathworld Forest. I'm using base layer consistency again, and I cover the skin almost entirely, leaving the holes darker and some areas on the lower side on the hands. Try to pick out the lower eyelids around the eyes. I did that off camera since there is no way of capturing that without blocking what I'm doing with the brush. And if your paint consistency is thick enough, you can just overdose these textures on the hand easily, like you would use a dry brush, but with a little bit more precision, so the paint won't flow into the small holes of the skin. Always check the paint on your hand before going straight to the mini, so you'll develop a good habit to use the right consistency every time. Okay, now we give some shapes to our red highlights with burnt red. Since we use the airbrush with the same color, now we can layer in this with our brush and define the shape of our highlights. So a small breakdown of how your highlights would look. On the arms, we have these cylinder shapes, so we highlight those areas with rectangular shaped highlights that are parallel. The legs are more likely cylinders as well, but with all the muscles and folds of the clothes, we need to follow those with our highlights, okay? So our rectangular shapes need to be more rounded around the edges. The chest is a rounded shape with somewhat flat parts, so it is a rounded shape with more volume on the upper half. The helmet is a sphere, but it has all these bends and crackles on it. With this current paint we are using for the highlights, we only need to register the cracks, so don't cover them, okay? Our main highlight shape is completely round, the field circle shape, but I really like the edge highlight on the character's ID card, and I'd like to recreate it, so I paint a halo over the helmet. Now if you're a beginner with highlight placement, let me tell you that this highlight won't make so much sense compared to our other highlights, okay? Because this is a different light source. so it's a little bit more advanced. We only do this because when we take a photo of the Mini, it's going to look freaking cool. Like there is another bright light source creates this halo highlight, okay? That is coming from the left and a little bit from the back, but we are not going to acknowledge this highlight on any other area of the Mini, okay? We only do this to make it look cool. It does not going to make perfect sense, and that's fine. On the back, we acknowledge the foils of the suit and highlight everything that fades towards our light source, and you add more volume as long as your mid-tone looks dark red. But if you prefer another color and you just watch this because you enjoy the voice of Papa Labords, then that's fine too, and thanks for being here. I mix some black to the burnt red and make a touch-up around for my highlights. Maybe on some areas I added too much highlight, or I want to fix the cracks on the helmet. Maybe the shape of my highlight is not as accurate, so it's all about making sure I have a good foundation to build up on, and I didn't do much of a blending at this stage, so I won't ruin my work or have to do double work if I later want to fix this. Okay? So check your highlights, and if you are satisfied, then proceed to the next step. Once I'm happy with, with my highlights, I do some stippling around the areas I like to blend a little bit more. So shape your brush's tip on your knuckle and create these small dots between the burnt red and burnt red mixed with the black layers. After that, I do a quick round of blending with Word Bearer's red, diluting the paint to a thin consistency and removing the excess on a paper towel. I move my brush from the lower to the higher value layer all the time. I don't do this step on the bands that wrapped around the hand, so they will look like they are made of a different material than the suit. I do around 5 rounds of this, and then I move on to the next step. I mix some Wild Rider red to the burnt red and reduce the highlight areas over the helmet and the suit, and I leave the bands on the arms. Now, if your highlight shapes are nice and defined at this step, you only need to reduce the size of them and try to emphasize the detail of the surface. I focus on the helmet, chest, back and the left eye area and leave the right side of the Mini darker since the right arm casts a shadow over those areas. If your previous layers are nice and opaque, you can layer in the colors easily and make smooth blends like Granny's butt cheek. I continue the process with pure Wild Rider red and reduce the highlight areas even more. At this step, I do add some highlights on the bands, and it's very important that these highlights line up with each other as one continuous line, because if you think about it, these shapes are cylinders, so light would be reflected in the same angle, not counting the secondary highlights, of course. I highlight the top half of the suit, applying it over the bigger folds that face towards the light source, and I also cover all the rivets on the helmet. Some ice yellow to the Wild Rider red to push the contrast over the helmet and chest, and also on the bands on the hands. Now we want to use these highlights to move our focal point to the head. On the helmet, I need to add a somewhat rectangular shape for these highlights, because if you make them too round, then the helmet will lose the beat-up characteristics. This is not a pristine thing, so we want to express that with our work. On the bands, just reduce the highlight areas a bit more and paint those straight lines over them so they will look more glossy. On the halo highlight of the helmet, I apply more layers on the right side, which is left if we look at it from the front, to make the effect more visible from our money shot angle. I also do some edge highlights over the lower half, on the eye and mouth hole of the helmet. Now I use black and add some more little cracks around the helmet and fix the bigger sculpted cracks if I need to. It's just some extra detail that makes the helmet more beat up. After that, I use the Wild Rider red and ice yellow mixture to paint an outline on the lower half of these black spots to add some depth to them, and make them feel more like little cracks. Now, Papa Laborts needs to admit that I'm addicted to purple for some reason. I'm using the airbrush again to add more depth to the shadow tones of the mini with royal purple. You could say that green would be more convenient to create some complementary shadows to the red suit, which is quite a fair point, but I have a much more valid argument for purple. I like purple more than green. And that's about it. I think purple is more of a mysterious tone than green, and I don't want to create something that looks harmonic. I want to create something that looks more evil and weird, and I think the red suit with purple shadows gives me more of that vibe. Now, if you use too much purple, just go back with the brush and curve your shadows, and aim these over the extreme shadows and shadow halftones, okay? You will have some eventually on your midtones, but if the consistency is similar to what I'm using, it won't be that visible. We have a nice hue for our shadow tones, so let's highlight the skin more since it looks a bit dull next to our suit. I'm using brown rose for that and pick out those boils one by one over my highlight areas. I also highlight the lips and the lower eyelid, but I'm sorry I couldn't record that process since those are super tiny details. After that, I use a very thin glaze of German Camo Bright Green to add a little bit of a green hue to my midtones. I aim it more towards my shadow halftones because I don't want to end up with a completely green skin, since this color is quite saturated, but it adds some nice tonal variation for the rotten skin. For the maximum highlights of the skin, I mix some ice yellow to the brown rose and highlight the boils inside my previous brown rose layer. All my zombie heroes have the glowy orange eye look, so I glaze some fluorescent orange over the eyeballs and eyelids. Since the eyes have a big shadow over them because of the helmet, it's not going to be super visible or spectacular, but you know, we know it's there and that makes us happy. Like when Granny Laborts thought she is out of cigarettes but finds another one behind her ear. To make our shadows integrated with the suit, I give it a round of glaze with royal purple, where the skin is exposed, and I apply it to the recessed shadows. I also give it a round for the suit as well, where I didn't want to overspray with the airbrush, like on the helmet next to those little cracks. On the skin, it also creates a more sick looking skin tone, which is quite fitting for this mini. With that, Zombie Juggernaut is done and ready for the table. A huge thanks to my Patreons who support these kind of videos, and if you're interested in some exclusive content, PDF guides for other characters of the game that won't receive a video guide, please consider supporting me on Patreon. Also, special shoutout goes to Cold-Blooded Dom trying to paint minis, Jonathan Mosner, Glitchy McCrash, Penoman45, Cameron Hilario. I hope your day will be as smooth as a granny's butt cheek.